just a quick thing, and hopefully over the course of time this will change. But right now in the United States, Alzheimer's is the disease that is feared. It's the second most feared disease behind cancer. And it's really, really, folks are just afraid of it. And just a couple of, there are charts similar to this in your Alzheimer's section. It's not exactly the same one, but this just kind of gives you some ideas of symptoms, cognitive symptoms, behavioral kinds of things, and just functional results of people having Alzheimer's disease. And lots of times, you know, people do become aware that they have it because they are forgetting things. They're just having trouble stringing things together in a way that's different from the way that they normally function. And I think lots of times people have some idea of it a long time, maybe before they say anything or their spouse says anything. You know, my dad didn't have Alzheimer's, but he did have some dementia. And I can remember at one point I had offered him, well, it was an electronic typewriter that actually, it was almost a computer. This was many years ago when my first daughter went off to college. That's what I sent her off with. It's just a little bit pre-computer days. And after she was finished with it, I offered it to my dad, and my dad was always kind of a techie person. You know, he built radios, he did all kinds of things when I was younger, and he just wasn't at all interested. And it sort of surprised me, and thinking back on that, I'm thinking, he knew he was having trouble learning new things and remembering how to do things. And he did, you know, he said, oh, it just makes me too anxious. And I think, you know, but at the time I was going, I can't figure out why he doesn't want this. This seems like something he would like, you know. So there's that sense of knowing something is wrong. I can remember talking to a resident at Friendship Village once who said he was very angry that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. He was a very smart man. He didn't like feeling dumb, which is the way he talked about the disease making him feel, because he said to me as we were having this conversation, 10 minutes from now, I will not remember that I've talked to you about this. But he also felt greatly justified in the fact that the diagnosis had been made, because he said, I knew there was something wrong. So there's that, knowing something's wrong, not wanting to hear the diagnosis, and kind of living in the tension between those two things. And I think particularly for people who have been valued because of their intellectual abilities, it's just a really devastating and difficult diagnosis to hear. And the other thing that I knew about, I really knew that there was something wrong with my dad, was when my mom started reporting that he was having trouble finding his way around the town he had lived in for 20 years. And my dad always prided himself on knowing the most efficient way to get from point A to point B in any place he lived. And when he's having trouble getting from point A to point B, there's something really wrong. So as the disease goes on, you have more and more short-term memory issues. And people begin having trouble, and the thing that I notice often with residents, that they couldn't find words. They couldn't name things. You know, and we all suffer from that from time to time, but when someone is really in the grip of the disease, it becomes pretty obvious. And they get lost really easily. And some of us get lost easily, you know, even when we don't have Alzheimer's disease. So. Right. And sometimes the GPS leads you astray. So, you know, what can you do? Oh, yeah. And so as the disease progresses in the late stages, there's both short and long-term memory deficits. Often people almost completely quit talking, become, and begin having problems with swallowing and walking, and don't recognize people and recognize themselves. It's a difficult disease. One of the reasons that Alzheimer's is so feared in our culture is that we have become what some people have called a hypercognitive culture. You know, particularly as we, you know, our economy we're not based on making things with our hands much anymore. You know, it's a knowledge economy, it's a service economy. A lot of it's based on what we know and how we use our brains for that. And so we become really identified as people with our ability to think and to remember and process information. It's almost like, you know, as we've developed computers, we've expected our mind to become more and more like a computer. And if it doesn't function like the computer functions and easy retrieval and all of that good stuff, then it's like, you know, we've totally lost ourselves. And, you know, this has been since, you know, the Enlightenment. You know, Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." And so we've kind of equated personhood with thinking. And that's very deeply ingrained. And which is why so often I think when people have Alzheimer's disease then, you know, you hear a lot of language around, well, the person isn't there anymore. Or it's like they're not dead, but they're not here. And their personhood really gets discounted because they're not kind of fitting in this hypercognitive culture that we live in. And so I think one of the things that as Christians, we have some tools and we have some theological frameworks that help us address this in the sense that we don't necessarily equate personhood with mind. I mean, sometimes we do. We live in the same culture as everybody else. But I think there's some other strands of the tradition that help us, that we can draw from, to help us kind of counteract this idea of that they're not there anymore. And these folk in this book called Rethinking Alzheimer's Care, they have a chapter on kind of nurturing the soul. And they talk in there about that in some ways, confronting Alzheimer's gives us an opportunity to think about soulfulness and the experience of the soul. And they define soul as a place inside each of us where deeper thoughts and feeling exist. It is a place where we go to think, feel, and communicate on a different, more intimate level than our everyday existence. It's a place that encourages us to free our minds, feel with our hearts, and experience the moment, recognizing the extraordinary in the ordinary. And you know, basically, folks with Alzheimer's have the present moment. And you know, there's so much out there in terms of spiritual practices these days that are encouraging us to be present now, not worrying about what happened in the past, not concentrating on the future, and we have, those of us who are hypercognitive, have a really hard time being totally present now because we have all this other stuff in our brain that's pulling us both back and forward. And we're easily distracted, and we just have trouble focusing and being present now. Well, that's what people with Alzheimer's have. They have now. And so I think coming alongside them and learning to be in their world is actually kind of a gift to us in the sense that it teaches us how to be here now and to pay attention to what's going on inside and our soul and our feelings. And there's just a whole lot more that goes on than thinking. If we're living in this hypercognitive environment, we need to also remember other pieces of life. A person with dementia, and this is from Virginia Bell and David Troxell, is a person of infinite value. And I think in the Christian tradition especially, we need to affirm that. You know, we are all created in God's image, and we bear that image all of our life. And and because of that, every person is a person of infinite value. And we need to be thinking about how we serve them. Is a person with a name. They may not always know their name, but they are a person with a name. I did the Good Shepherd story in the ALZHEIME'S, not unit here, and I was going around beforehand because I didn't know the group. I brought name tags, and I was asking them for their names and giving them a name tag so that I could know their names as we were doing things. And one woman just gave me a name. And then the aide walked in and she said, "That's not her name." I guess, you know, she had a name. It wasn't her name, but, you know. So it was kind of cute. But, you know, but they still have a name. They have a history. And you know how names kind of evoke the person. And they are a person with a spirit. They are a person with feelings. And this is something that in the Alzheimer's arena, they pick up on feelings and they express feelings. And it's one way into their world is to kind of key in on the feeling level that you're experiencing. They are a person with will and personality. And you still see that. They are a person with a life story. And they have a physical environment that they're living in. And they have the present moment. And they are a person who is still here. A person with dementia may still be a person who gives and receives love and affection. And I've experienced that a lot. A person who could reminisce and respond to stories from others. A person who is compassionate and concerned. Susan McFadden, who with her husband has just come out with this book called Aging Together, Dementia, Friendship, and Flourishing Communities, and she's really talking about how churches can create the kind of communities that support people with dementia.
What's her name?
Susan McFadden. Her husband is a pastor. She's a psychologist. Susan was a teacher at that training course that I went to many years ago. And she's done a lot of research work observing the behaviors of people with Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's units. And what she and her colleagues have discovered is that the residents will and do express concern and care for their fellow residents. And she's observed 2 residents having a conversation that made absolutely no sense to anybody else, but it was obvious from the tone and the body language that they were expressing concern and care for one another and for things that were happening in their unit. And you know, she's been really great about just helping us understand that the feelings and some of that heart concern kind of stuff is still present. We just have to learn how to recognize it. And is a person who enjoys verbal and nonverbal communication. A person who can be surprisingly flexible. And a person who has a sense of humor. I've experienced that a lot. Who can be productive, who likes to feel productive. A person who can have intact social graces, can still be very courteous, kind, you know, does all those things that they were taught by their mothers probably. A person who maintains old skills and talents, who thrives on arts, sometimes inviting people to paint, music, it accesses different parts of us. And there have been some amazing things done in the arts. And a person who experiences all five senses. Yeah. And a person who responds to the experience of new information. There used to be this thing that says, oh, people with Alzheimer's can't learn anything. And what they've discovered is that people with Alzheimer's can learn things. They can learn procedures. And I think that, as someone who's like gone into an Alzheimer's worship, space and done worship weekly, and I found that when I walk in, they couldn't tell you my name, but they tend to know why I'm there. They're happy to see me. And because I've done it the same way every week, they sort of fall into this routine and rhythm, and in a sense, they've learned it. And I think one of the things that, we get all hung up on memory and not remembering, and one of the things that's just been brought home to me so much is that we may not, all of us forget things, but God doesn't forget, and God remembers. And in the biblical story, to be remembered by God is to be held in existence and to live. Particularly, you look at the Old Testament stories. When God remembered God's people, they knew that he was with them and they were able to live. When they felt like God had abandoned them, that's when they died, and that's when things went really bad. And so to be forgotten by God means death. And there's this wonderful, in the Genesis account of Noah, he's out floating on the water and feels like he's been there forever. And then there's this verse that says, and God remembered Noah. And then all these things start happening, with the waters receding and the dove and everything. But what we need to remember, that God's remembering isn't kind of this cognitive mental operation that we tend to think of as remembering. But it's God's remembering, these are really big theological words, efficacious, providential, and salvific activity. But it was action. He acted on their behalf. He did things that saved them, that provided what they needed when they needed it. All the ways we think about the providence of God, well, he was there for them, provided the way back. The Red Sea parted, and they experienced his remembering as presence. He was present with them. And, we really see this in the Exodus story, with the pillar of fire by day or night and the clouds by day. There were visual symbols of his presence with them. And there was a relationship. There were mutual acts back and forth. But when God remembers, God acts. And so I think we're called to remember like God remembers. So and particularly for people who can't remember, we remember them. In some cases, we almost remember for them. And I think for your man who's having trouble praying, I'm almost wondering if there couldn't be a person who becomes his spiritual companion, and maybe they sit down together, and if he can't quite form the words, they can have a conversation, and then that person can pray for him. I think we need to be creative and think about how can we be present and helpful for folks. And I think, keeping all of that in mind and thinking about ministry to people with Alzheimer's, we assume that they're equal with us. It's sort of this radical equality where we're not making a hierarchy of cognitively impaired, non-cognitively impaired, but that we are all equal before God, and that they have their own integrity and they have their own wisdom to share. And we believe that there's quality of life possible, even in the absence of cognitive abilities. And we look for ways, the social, emotional, physical, and spiritual doorways into that person's world, and not just relying on the cognitive. And we believe that persons with Alzheimer's have spiritual needs and benefit from spiritual care. One of you were saying as we were going around the table, I think this is an area we've tended to neglect. And I think you're right. But I think it's an area that, part of it is we need to learn. We need to learn enough and be in that world enough so that we can begin to be creative and think about how can this be possible. But I think, Shirley, you were saying one of you had been paired up with an Alzheimer's person, Kimber. I think that's a wonderful thing, that as a Stevens ministry, you're beginning that process, and and you're someone who can walk through that with them. I mean, you're way ahead of most churches. So that's an amazing thing.